What's up, Hardly Typical Podcast family? We are back. Listen, I just want to dive straight in because our last episode after our winter break dropped on January 20th, and we started at a very important conversation about the incoming administration and some of the talk about eliminating possibly the Department of Education. And we talked about some of the concerns that people in our community, the disability community, have expressed about what that might look like. But Dr. Lee, we ended that episode, and I just want to jump back in. This is part two. Certainly, if you have not watched or listened to part one of this two-part episode, make sure that you go back and listen to the podcast that dropped on January 20th so you can sort of catch up. But I just want to jump in because we talked about IEPs and 504s, and I'm glad we did that. But what I want to do is for someone who, like me, may be a little bit of a novice again when it comes to actually experiencing what it's like to actually come together with your educators to create an actual IEP. I've heard some stories. I've never sat in on a meeting. I know there are some people, maybe even like yourself, who sat in on meetings to help family members navigate. I know that's something that some people actually want people to do, is going with them. I've never had that experience, but I've heard some stories about, how you arrive at what those accommodations look like. So can you share with our listening audience, people who are maybe novices like me, what is that like? So when you're going in to do an IEP, you're having that meeting, how does it start? What initiates it? What is the meeting like? What does it feel like? Can you just share a little bit of what that's like so that our listeners get a good sense of maybe why some people are concerned?
Sure. So there's several ways to get an IEP. Some children, you can tell as early as birth that they're going to need some accommodations. They're going to need help. So upon their entrance into the Department of Education at 3, you're able to get an IEP.
Okay.
It's an appointment with the Department of Education in your city, and you're able to sit down and go over those accommodations. Other people are diagnosed a bit later. They have some trouble in school, whether it be behavioral or academic, which leads to a diagnosis. And from there, you sit down with a teacher. You sit down, usually it varies, but it's usually the teacher, a counselor. And then there's usually a, what do they call it? A special education coordinator.
Okay.
And then as a parent, you are actually allowed to invite anyone. You can invite 17 family members if you want. They don't always tell you that, though. So there's a form you sign that says, I let you know that you can invite anyone. I didn't tell you that you couldn't invite someone. However, I have seen that paper be pushed in between. Okay, this one is for this is for that. Okay, sign that. Okay, sign that. And this one is for that. You notice how I didn't describe those other papers? So people are essentially signing, I didn't tell you you couldn't bring someone, but that specific paper isn't always being explained.
Right.
So I had parents say, I didn't know I could bring someone with me, only to be later told, well, you signed the paper. But when you're handed a book of papers by someone you don't know, sometimes you understand some and sometimes you don't. But this signing is essential for my child to get help. So I have heard those meetings be described in a plethora of ways. My experience has been that I don't believe any parent, caregiver, or loved one should have to do their first IEP meeting alone. I think it should be a legal mandate that a parent advocate be with them during their first meeting. First of all, it's overwhelming. The personal feelings that you have to process can be a lot.
Right. Because this is your child.
It is your child. And to say leave your feelings at home is impossible. As a parent or a caregiver, you have a relationship with that person, with that child. So you're already, okay, what do I need? But then when you're thrown acronyms that you maybe have never heard of, or areas and aspects of education that you aren't familiar with because this isn't your professional background,
right,
it can be overwhelming. It can be overwhelming. It could take time to process. You don't know the questions to ask because it's a new environment. So you're just like, okay, do you have any questions? No. Because half the stuff you said, I don't even understand.
Yeah.
I'm going to go home and Google.
Yeah. It sounds like a lot. Like I have never done it, but again, I've, in my 20 plus years of ministry, I've done a lot of work with parents.
It can be overwhelming.
It can be overwhelming. Like a lot.
Advocates are expensive and free advocates have a long wait list. So a lot of parents are doing it alone. I have had experiences where IEP meetings were done online, and the entire time the camera was pointed at the wall.
Wow.
I've seen IEP meetings where it was, they pulled the camera down, so it was like on someone's chest who was clearly working while the other people were in the room. Oh, we're talking to you, Mom. You can hear us? Okay. Okay. So, but I can't see anyone. I don't know what's going on. But what isn't always told is at any point that you're uncomfortable, you can stop the meeting and you can ask for reasonable accommodations. If your reasonable accommodations are meeting at McDonald's, we're having an IEP meeting at McDonald's. Wow. But a lot of parents don't know that they have the power and the authority to do that because that can be inconvenient for professionals.
Right.
So IEP meetings can be very stressful. I've heard some people say they had a great time. They were complimentary. They explained well. But if I'm honest, they're few and far between that I've heard explained that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have to admit, like, I love my educators. I have two siblings who are teachers. One of the churches that I pastored was in a city that almost, I would say 30% of our congregation were teachers. So I understand the stresses that they're under, but you're right. I have not heard, and this is why I asked you to kind of share a little bit for novices like me, because I haven't heard. I can count on one hand the amount of times I've heard one of my parents that I was pastoring that had a positive experience with an IEP meeting.
Yeah. So I've never had one. The positive experiences have been stories told to me. I've never been a part of a positive IEP experience.
That's unfortunate, but it's important for our listeners to hear the realities of that. Like, like I said, I've done a lot of work in this area. That's not something that I have particular experience with, but the stories that I've been told and the people that I've prayed with, I can honestly say I have just never, I can't recall very many positive stories about IEPs. So we know that it can be overwhelming. You come to the point in needing this. What are some of the things that you would say before we transition that parents would need to know as far as making sure at least that the accommodations that they feel like their child need are actually put into the plan? Because it sounds like there's a lot of conversation, but like you said, once it's put on paper, this is a legal document. So how do I make sure that what I know my child needs is put on that paper?
Well, here's the thing. The IEP meeting, the document won't be written up right then. After the IEP meeting, it'll be written up and sent to you. So you have some time and you can give other people eyes on it. Hey, check this out for me. Tell me if this makes sense. Is this? But I also would say, and I want to shout out all my teachers. All my teachers, you get heart emojis from me. Okay?
Yes.
Because oftentimes it's not always the teachers that you're fighting. Many a times the teachers will say, little Johnny needs X, Y, and Z. But it can sometimes be budget, administration, lack of resources, even short of staff. Since COVID, we've seen that there's a shortage of teachers.
Yes.
That say, we simply can't do this. the teacher knows what the child needs. They simply can't do this. I would say build a relationship with that teacher. If you can, if you feel comfortable with them, and if you feel like they'd be honest with you. Have conversations with that teacher, just you and that teacher, because they may be able to shine a light. Not saying they know your child better than you, but they may be able to give you some insight on your child's growth and development within that classroom. There are some organizations throughout the United States that will offer you free parent advocates.
Okay.
Those parent advocates actually will sit with you through IEP meetings. And they will explain to you the process because they know the process and they've done this.
Okay.
Now, here's the other side of that coin, Lamar. A lot of these advocates are super expensive. And if you're already on a tight budget due to medical expenses or your household income, that can really be taxing, which is why I would encourage you to look for free advocates. But also, if that's not an option for you, see if you can find special education teacher, maybe from your congregation, maybe from your community, maybe from your sorority or fraternity. See if you can find a special education teacher. They might not know everything, but they know something.
Yeah, they know
and that
enough.
something can help you. Absolutely. Absolutely. So it may take a little more legwork.
Okay.
But find someone. Don't allow your eyes to be the only eyes that look at that IEP, because you don't know what you don't know.
Now, listen, I need you to say that again about don't let your eyes be the only.
Don't let your eyes be the only eyes that look at that IEP before you sign it.
That's important. I just want to pause and acknowledge that right there. As the young folks say, that part.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's not something that, and I'll be honest with you, that's not something that if you're not experienced with it, like you said, you would think everybody has your best interests at heart. Everybody has your child's best interests at heart. And I'm sure a lot of them do. But like you said, budget constraints, and there's all other pressures that our teachers are facing. But if you don't know, you're just trusting.
You are strangers. You're trusting strangers.
And you're trusting a process. And you're
Uh-huh.
trusting a process that, you know, you're depending on to accommodate your child.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you said that, you know.
And let me give you an example, Lamar. I'm going to give you an example of this because it's not all bad. It's not all bad. And that's why the Department of Education is important. The Department of Education keeps those regulations in place, those checks and balances, so that no one's going rogue. There was a IEP that was written for a young boy about 3 years old, two and a half, 3. In that IEP, the professionals were able to look at him and say, okay, you know, we're running through a battery of tests. I think he had been going through testing for about 2 days with the Department of Education. And in their final meeting, they finally wrote up their draft of his IEP, and in it, they wrote autism. Well, the parent was upset because he hadn't even officially been diagnosed yet. So the parent thought, what are you guys doing? He hasn't been diagnosed. But in actuality, they were trying to help. They were trying to get him the accommodations he needed and put that in because he subsequently, less than 30 days later, was diagnosed with autism.
Okay.
And he had a severe autism. So they wanted him to get those accommodations. So they were trying to help. But because the parent was ignorant to the process or even ignorant to what they were doing, she began to fight. And she didn't realize that wasn't an area that she needed to fight. They were putting it in there because if they had just simply written a developmental delay, he would have been eligible for different accommodations than he was with an actual autism diagnosis written in his IEP.
Yeah.
But you don't know what you don't know. So when you allow other people in and get that trusted circle may not be your mom, your sister, your cousin, your aunt. It may not be anyone in your family. But get people who can look at it and give you an educated understanding or their experience understanding of those accommodations. That was a help, not a hindrance. But because mom didn't know, Mom was ready to fight.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it wasn't until later she realized, oh, that wasn't her point of contention.
Yeah.
That was actually you all looking out for me.
Yeah. Now, I don't, this is not a situation with the IEP per se, but I remember years ago as a youth pastor at a church I eventually became the pastor of, and I had a mother who had twin boys, and they were teenagers at the time. I think maybe even preteen, but they were talking about. She brought up something to me about, and I was very ignorant at the time of the whole process, but it basically came down to medication and some other accommodations for, I believe it was ADHD. And I bring this up because you talk about like having in the IEP the label of autism without actually first having the diagnosis, and how that triggered a lot of things. And I'm sure that that's experiences that parents have had. And because this is the Hardly Typical podcast, insights and intersections is our thing. I found that to be almost a typical sort of experience for families of color. And this happened with this particular mom that I was talking with, that, and one of the things that she said, because as you talked about that, it triggered a memory, was she didn't want her, one of the reasons why she was fighting against what was being recommended for her children was she didn't want them to quote unquote have that label. Now that's a whole other discussion that we could have.
That's definitely another episode.
Yeah, that's a whole other discussion we could have, particularly as it relates to children of color.
Yeah. We're going to put a pin in that, though.
Yes, we need to come back to that. And I actually think you and I are doing a workshop later on this year at a conference that talks about that. So we'll share more info later. Yeah, we'll have another episode. But when you said the autism came up in the IEP, what I heard was, and what I heard with this mom was the issue of the label. And I remember after I was diagnosed in 2014, and of course I was not in school, I remember having that conversation about labels. And one of the things that I encourage, and why I bring this up, is I would encourage parents, and a lot of them unfortunately had the same experience that you just described, are families of color that I was working with. And I would tell them that people are already labeling your children. And so that's what I'm trying to get to, is that can be scary sometimes to find that label in a document that becomes legally binding, especially if that hasn't been official.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of what I hear from our community sometimes is not wanting to have that label.
Yeah.
But what I learned is that the school system and the teachers and their peers are already labeling them. And in some sense, it feels like, at least when you finally are able to get these things down on a piece of paper, an IEP that will begin to give them the reasonable accommodations, that if a label comes along with that, at least it's a label now that you can have a little bit more control over, is what I'm getting at. Because they're already labeling your child either lazy or defiant or...
I love that you said that. I love that you said that, because here's the truth of the matter. We all label each other. We classify each other before we've even had a conversation with each other, whether I want to approach you or not. Why do I want to approach you? Why don't I want to approach you? We're labeling each other. Right. The great thing about an IEP, it doesn't mean you're not smart. What it does mean is, I know what you need and I'm going to ensure you get it.
Right.
A lot of parents can't be afraid. I don't want him to be blackballed. I don't want people to talk about him. An IEP, that's for those other kids. But all an IEP does is ensures your child gets what they need to enhance their educational experience.
Yes.
It's a good thing. Yeah. And what we don't want to do is have them struggle, have them toil, have it be such a chore for them to get through school when all we could have done was written up an IEP with accommodations, with some modifications, and they could have breezed through it. We want success, right? We want our kids to succeed. So let's not look at IEPs as a failure. Let's not look at IEPs as a bad thing. Let's not look at 504s as, one of those. But these are excellent ways to make sure our kids get what they need.
Yeah. Yeah. So you said something important. I want to shift gears here. You said something important about this conversation about the Department of Education and some of the talk of the incoming administration previously saying that there was going to be an elimination of the Department of Education. You said something important to say that the Department of Education is what gives the oversight so that people don't go rogue and that they actually have to follow those plans. So because we have a lot of people who are, and I would say this, rightfully concerned, especially people in our community, disability community, are rightfully concerned. Let's kind of shift gears and talk about, obviously this is very early. We dropped this episode, both parts. It's very early on in the administration. The first part of this is on Inauguration Day. This particular second part will be the following week. So we're very early on in this journey. But what might it look like if, in fact, this administration does successfully eliminate the Department of Education? What might that look like for people in our community who have children who are in need of these services? Because if there's no government agency that's going to oversee and make sure that these things are being done and these accommodations, so basically it feels like, and this is what I'm here for people, that there's going to be no accountability as to whether or not my child will actually get what they need.
Yeah.
So what might that look like if that does happen? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. So let's go ahead and say this is alleged, right?
Yes.
So it could happen. It might not happen. But the great thing about it is we got a robust conversation out of it. And hopefully people walk away learning a little bit more about IEPs, about 504s, about the Department of Education, because to know better is to do better.
Yeah.
So in the instance that the Department of Education is eliminated, which could very much so happen, there's a couple things.
Okay.
The first thing is that the Department of Education could be eliminated, which means the responsibilities could shift. But let's talk about IDEA, which is an acronym.
Okay.
IDEA, IDEA. IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So that is a law that mandates free and appropriate public education.
Gotcha.
Even if the Department of Education is eliminated, there is still a law in place, IDEA, that mandates free and appropriate public education.
Gotcha.
So let's take a deep breath on that.
Yes. Exhale.
Inhale, exhale. No one's going to get expelled from school effective immediately, which it can be a real fear if you're unaware. So it would not be automatically eliminated if the Department of Education were dismantled. It is a law that is in place.
Right.
Now, let's talk about if the Department of Education is eliminated, the responsibilities for IDEA may shift to other departments.
Gotcha.
It could become the Department of Health and Human Services. It could become the Department of Justice.
Okay.
They could have an oversight. Or there could be state level variations.
Okay.
Because the Department of Education is no longer overseeing national education. So what that looks like is it now looks like the implementation of IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, now may vary significantly across states. Because you're now being led by the state's government.
Right.
So that could potentially lead to disparities in the quality and availability of services for students with disabilities.
And I think that's maybe the concern that some of the people in our community have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's already a very real fact that some states are more disability friendly than others.
Mm-hmm.
It's already a very real fact that some states are much more accommodating than others.
Yeah.
So that could be magnified if the Department of Education were to go away.
Mm. Yeah.
So also some potential risk. States might face resource and expertise gaps, making consistent enforcement and funding more challenging.
Okay.
Advocacy could be critical to ensuring protection under this idea that still is needed, because your idea of reasonable accommodation and my idea of reasonable accommodation could be very different. So those gaps widen.
Yeah. Because that, when you say reasonable accommodations, like you said, that leaves, I guess, in my mind, and of course, I don't want to, suppose to know legally, but it just seems very ambiguous. And like you said, that ambiguity can lead to
absolutely
a lot of gaps in services, and I know this maybe not to the extent of the education piece, but I've dealt a lot with and done a lot of research and even spoken a lot about things like diagnostic disparities. And a lot of that has to do with ambiguity as far as, how things are defined, how things are understood, what is. So I can easily, I bring that up because I can easily see if the Department of Education is eliminated and it becomes up to each individual state. Once you allow for that level of ambiguity, it can lead to disparities, because I've seen it in diagnostics for children, and especially for children of color and for girls.
Absolutely.
And so I guess my concern, and some of the concern that I've heard from other people, is that eliminating that oversight opens the gateway to so much ambiguity that it's almost impossible not to experience disparity.
Yeah. You're right.
Yeah.
You're right. So even if I really want to make sure parents hear this, parents and students alike.
Okay.
If the Department of Education were to be eliminated, students are still protected, legally protected under IDEA.
Yeah.
With that said, practical access to services is going to be very ambiguous.
Yeah.
Practical access, because here's a simple example as I can give you. I can give you a meal or I can give you a cracker. Either way, I fed you.
Wow. Just sit with that for a minute, because that's a really practical and good example of the type of ambiguity that I'm talking about. And, if you haven't listened to part one of this conversation, we started off talking about Dr. King's sermon in 1966, which was 12 years after segregation was considered illegal. And in his sermon, he talked about, I think it was 5.2% of students had been integrated in the South, and that was like a 1% progress. It would take 90-something years if they kept going at that pace. And the reason why that's important, why I'm tying that back in, is because legally, segregation in 1954 became illegal.
Yeah.
Dr. King is preaching in 1966, 12 years later.
Yeah.
And he's talking about the progress that hadn't been made, when progress is not being made, it's called regression.
There you go.
And the reason I bring that up is because you're right. The students are protected legally. But a lot of what Dr. King and other civil rights leaders fought for was having federal oversight to make sure that there was some teeth.
There you go.
To making sure that the things that were legal were actually being followed.
There you go.
And so I think that's, if I could say what I've been hearing, I think that's people's concern, is we know that there are legal protections, even with Voting Rights Act, right? It was legal for African Americans to vote. You see where I'm going?
I do.
But because it was left up to each state to determine voter eligibility, they had to go back and say, we need federal protection because some of these states, like you said, are more friendly to African Americans voting than others. And some were putting hoops and barriers in that were legal in the states. And they were saying, we're not preventing them from voting, but they would put in, we know the history, like, they would ask ridiculous questions like how many bubbles are in a, bar of soap and those types of things. Yeah. So I think this is why I said in part one, and even I'll say it again, this is why people have real concerns. So I'm glad that you said it's still legal, but I think what we also have to remember, and like you said, it brings up a conversation. And if it helps any for those who are listening who have not really been part of the disability rights or disability justice movement, you understand why this is so important for people in our community now, because I can give you some examples, concrete examples of when something is legal, but it's left up to state and there's no federal protection or there's no teeth. We have history that has shown what could potentially happen if there's no federal oversight. So I just bring that up because this is where, for those who are excited about the incoming administration and don't understand why there are some people who are not excited, particularly as we talk about this one issue, I just wanted to bring that up as a way of giving you a historical evidence of what could possibly happen when there's no federal oversight for something that is still a law that states have to abide, but states get to decide how to implement that law. We have concrete evidence of what could possibly happen. And I want our listeners who don't understand why people are concerned to sort of reflect on that history as we're coming off the heels of celebrating Dr. King, and we're actually moving into Black History Month. Go back and look at that history and understand why people in the disability community are concerned, because we have stories and we have history and we have data that shows that when there is no federal protection for certain things and states are left to design their own way of implementing those laws, sometimes it leads to some situations that we have history to kind of look back and see what could happen. So that's all I want people to be able to.
Definitely. I think in the part one, and I hope you guys have watched it. If not, make sure you go back. You shared one of your favorite pieces from Dr. King. I actually have a favorite moment, but it's not it's something that I heard about. I hope it's actually, I feel like his speechwriter confirmed that it was true when before he delivered those infamous words, "I have a dream." That as he was standing at the podium, there was a bit of a pause, and it was actually Mahalia Jackson who encouraged him to tell them about the dream. Tell them about the dream.
I've heard that too.
And here at the Hardly Typical Podcast, we're not just building a podcast, we're building a community. And I think one of the reasons why that stands out to me is because it shows his community. It shows that they believed in him and they encouraged him. And they weren't afraid of him outshining them or speaking better than them or him or anything like that. but they were encouraging him, share that dream, because we see that there's something in you that the world needs. So I would give that same challenge to our hardly typical community and say, you may not have a child with an IEP or a 504. You may not have any direct ties to the Department of Education, but check in with your community. Check in with your community. One of the most ableist things we can do is only worry about things that directly affect us. If it doesn't affect me, it's not a problem.
Yeah.
Check in with your community and ask them, hey, how are you doing? How are things affecting you? How are the changes affecting you? Are there ways I can support you? Are there ways I can speak up for you? Because while you may not know an advocate, I know one. So let me connect you with one. But I think the legacy of Dr. King is a legacy of community. He never marched alone. He had community behind him. Yeah. And I would charge our hardly typical listeners to begin to not only build community, but look after that community.
Yeah.
And I hope that's what we've done here by giving you this information about the Department of Education, about IEPs, about IDEA. I hope we have empowered you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I want to add, because that's a great point. And I feel like we've given enough to, spark this conversation.
Absolutely.
And we want to continue it online. But one of the things that is so brilliant about what you just said about the community is that I don't know how many people know this little bit of history, but even the little rift that King goes on, which was not a part of his speech, even though we name it the I Have a Dream speech. He talks about a lot of things. Go back and read the whole speech. He talks about a lot of things, particularly a lot of things that we've even talked about or even kind of touched on in this 2-part episode. But I don't know if a lot of people know this bit of history, but, as we talk about community, he actually got the inspiration for that rift about I Have a Dream from a sister named Prathia Hall. And a lot of people don't know that she was one of the more well-known parts, at least in the African-American community, as a preacher, as an advocate. Yeah. And the story goes that he had a conversation with her one night. I think it was after a speaking engagement that he had. And she began to talk a little bit about some of her dreams. And so when you talk about community, I love the fact that those two conversed about their dreams for their community. And it came across as him being a voice to even voice some of the dreams that people were sharing with him about what they wanted. Yeah. And so, as we sort of wrap up and talk about, like you said, it doesn't have to be an issue that directly affects you. I love how he took inspiration from her as a woman and said she had some dreams that she also wanted included in this movement of civil and human rights. And he sort of listened to that and took that, and it came out in what I feel like is a divine moment where the dreams of a community were expressed.
Absolutely.
It wasn't just King's dream. It was the dream of a community that he had walked with and sat with. And some of the issues that she shared with him were not particularly issues that affected him personally, but he heard her. Yeah. And he incorporated that into his dream. And he listened to another sister who said, share that. This is the moment. This is the time. And so I love how you sort of directed us as a community to share what our dreams are with each other, especially in this time. And so I would say I think that's a good place to leave it. We have people who are concerned. And so, we earlier said weep with those who weep, mourn with those who mourn, but also for those of us in this community and those of us who are adjacent to this community, share those dreams that we have for our children, for our young adults, for our individuals with disabilities. And I think the final word that Dr. Lee shared is good, is that we carry those dreams and those aspirations that we have as a community, and we speak for each other, and we speak with each other, about those dreams, and then we commit, especially in this year, to be even fiercer advocates and fiercer, people of faith and people of hope when it comes to ensuring equality and equity and justice for all those who are part of this community. So listen, Terisha, thank you for sharing with us this important information on parts 1 and 2.
It's a great conversation.
Yeah, I would say I learned a lot, not necessarily having direct insight into a lot of things that you shared. So thank you. And then, thank you to our Hardly Typical podcast community for tuning in.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being a community. Let's keep this conversation going online. So if you're on Instagram or Facebook, if you have any insight, any things that can add to this conversation, make sure that you share that with us. But also, as always, make sure that you share this podcast, share these episodes. This is actually the last episode of season 2.
Wow, we're wrapping season 2 already?
Wrapping season 2. So as you know, we do short seasons, but that also means that we'll be back in a couple weeks with season 3. So
wow, so
stay
cool.
tuned for that. Yeah, cool. We are actually moving along. And so if you got any ideas about what you want to talk about, what you want to hear about in season 3, make sure that you shoot those ideas to us as well.
Definitely.
But this is the last episode of season 2. Make sure that you share this episode and all other episodes with your family and friends. And we'll see you in a few weeks as we launch season 3 of the Hardly Typical podcast. Thank you again for your support, for your likes and your shares. We love you all, and we'll see you in season 3.